47,000 men stood against 250,000. The mathematics of war dictated their annihilation, yet by sunset on October 1st, 331 B.C., these outnumbered soldiers had not just survived, they had obliterated the largest empire the world had ever known in a single afternoon. The Persian Empire spanning from India to Egypt would cease to exist. By the end of this video, you'll understand how Alexander the Great achieved the impossible, turning certain defeat into history's most decisive victory. You'll discover the brilliant deception that made 250,000 soldiers useless, why Darius III's greatest strength became his fatal weakness, and the 30-second charge that changed civilization forever. Here's what the ancient sources don't tell you. On the morning of the most important battle in human history, Alexander overslept. His generals found him sleeping peacefully while 250,000 enemies waited just miles away. Meanwhile, the Persian Emperor Darius had stayed awake all night, pacing anxiously in his tent. But who really held the psychological advantage? How did Alexander make an entire Persian army exhaust itself without fighting? What tactical innovation neutralized the terror weapons of antiquity, those scythed chariots that were essentially ancient tanks? And why did the most powerful king on earth flee when victory seemed certain? Consider this. How could Scythed chariots with blades extending 3 feet on each side fail so spectacularly? How did a 25-year-old outmaneuver generals with decades of experience? These aren't just questions. They're the keys to understanding how the ancient world transformed in 4 bloody hours. The mathematics seemed impossible. The front WARRIORRS from a NKS 20 of MONGOLS nations. They had leveled the ground for miles to give their chariots and cavalry every advantage. They had learned from their previous defeats. Everything favored them, yet Alexander saw something others missed. To understand how 47,000 men destroyed an empire, we must first understand the world they were about to shatter. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of history's most decisive battles, hit that like button and subscribe for more epic war content. Now let me take you back to the scorching plains of Mesopotamia, where empires lived and died. The Persian Empire stretched from the Indus River to the Nile, from the Caucasus Mountains to the Arabian Sea. For over 2 centuries, it had been the superpower of the ancient world. Its roads connected 3 continents. Its treasury held the wealth of 20 nations. Its army had crushed every challenger. But Alexander had something Darius never expected, a claim to divinity itself. After visiting the oracle at Sewa, Alexander believed himself to be the son of Zeus Ammon. His soldiers called him the God King. Darius III, meanwhile, bore a different title, the last Achaemenid, though he didn't know it yet. This wasn't their first encounter. At the Granicus River, Alexander had shattered the myth of Persian invincibility. At Issus, he'd sent Darius fleeing from the battlefield, capturing his family in the process. These humiliations burned in the Persian emperor's mind, but here's what makes Gaugamela different. Darius had learned from defeat. The march through Mesopotamia told its own story. Alexander led his army through the cradle of civilization itself, past the ruins of Babylon's ancient walls, through lands where writing was invented, where the first cities rose from dust. Every step took them deeper into the heart of Persian power. The heat was crushing, water was scarce, disease threatened. But Alexander pushed forward. This is where the story takes a dark turn. This wasn't just about conquest. It was about revenge. The Greeks remembered Persian invasions, the burning of Athens, the desecration of their temples. Every Macedonian soldier marched with those memories. They weren't just fighting for Alexander's ambition. They were fighting to settle a blood debt that was 150 years old. The power dynamics were fascinating. On one side stood the heir to an empire that had existed since Cyrus the Great, commanding resources from 1/4 of the world's population. On the other stood a young king from a small mountain kingdom, whose father had been assassinated just 3 years earlier. Yet somehow the momentum belonged to Alexander. But wait, Darius had one final advantage. He chose the battlefield himself near the village of Gaugamela. He spent weeks preparing the ground, leveling it completely to maximize his numerical superiority. He cleared away every rock, every obstacle that might impede his chariots or cavalry. He was creating a killing field designed specifically to annihilate the Macedonian army. The Persian king positioned his forces carefully. Unlike previous battles where terrain had constrained him, here he could deploy his full might. Here, finally, the mathematics of war would assert themselves. How could 47, 0, 0 defeat 250, 0, 0 on ground chosen and prepared by their enemy? But Darius had learned from his mistakes, and at Gaugamela he would hold every advantage. The Persian host that assembled at Gaugamela defied comprehension. Ancient sources speak of 250, 0 souls drawn from every corner of the empire. At its heart stood the immortals, Persia's elite guard, their golden scale armor glinting in the desert sun. These weren't just soldiers, they were the embodiment of Persian might, each man chosen for size, strength, and absolute loyalty. From the eastern satrapies came the Bactrian and Scian horsemen, warriors who lived in the saddle, who could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy at full gallop. Their horses were larger than Greek mounts, bred for the steppes, trained for war. Then physics met flesh in the most brutal way. These riders carried lances longer than a man is tall, designed to punch through bronze armor, but the real genius was still to come. Darius had prepared 200 scythe chariots, each a masterpiece of military engineering. Picture this. Wheels, fitted with blades extending 3 feet on each side, designed to slice through infantry formations like a scythe through wheat. The horses were armored. The drivers were chosen from the bravest men in the empire. These weren't just vehicles. They were psychological weapons designed to shatter enemy morale. Nobody could have predicted what happened next. From the lands beyond the Indus came war elephants, their tusks capped with bronze, towers on their backs filled with archers. The ground shook when they walked, horses fled at their scent. Men who had never seen an elephant might break at the very sight of them. Against this host, Alexander fielded 47, 0 veterans, but numbers don't tell the whole story. At the army's core stood the phalanx Macedonian infantry armed with the sarissa, an 18 FD pike that gave them reach no other infantry possessed. These men had marched from Macedonia to Egypt to Mesopotamia. They had never lost a battle. The companion cavalry formed Alexander's hammer. These 200 horsemen were the sons of Macedonian nobility, trained from childhood, bound to their king by personal loyalty. They rode without stirrups, a detail that makes their effectiveness even more remarkable. Each man controlled his horse with his knees while wielding a 12-voot lance. Here's where it gets absolutely insane. The hyperspists, Alexander's elite infantry, occupied the crucial space between the phalanx and cavalry. These men could fight as heavy infantry or skirmishers, adapting instantly to battlefield conditions. They were Alexander's Swiss army knife, capable of any tactical role. But Alexander had one advantage nobody expected. Darius had ordered his men to stand to arms all night, fearing a night attack. The Persian drums echoed across the plain. Boom, 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 keeping 250 0 men awake, weapons ready, nerves fraying. Hour after hour passed. No attack came. Then came a sound no soldier ever forgets, the metallic ringing of weapons being checked, shields adjusted, armor tightened. Dawn was approaching. The Persians had been standing ready for 8 hours. Exhaustion crept through their ranks like poison. Meanwhile, the Macedonians had slept soundly, their king so confident he had overslept. The battlefield itself had become a character in this drama. Darius had cleared an area several miles wide, creating perfect terrain for his numerical advantage. But here's the detail that changes everything. By clearing the ground so thoroughly, he had also eliminated any defensive positions. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to anchor a defensive line if things went wrong. This single decision would echo through history. In trying to create the perfect offensive battlefield, Darius had also created the perfect arena for a decisive charge. The very preparations meant to ensure victory contained the seeds of catastrophe. As dawn broke on October 1st, 331 B.C.E., two worlds prepared to collide. The sun rose over Gaugamela to reveal a sight that would have broken lesser men. The Persian army stretched across the horizon, a glittering sea of bronze and steel. Macedonian scouts reported they couldn't see either end of the enemy line. It extended over 3 miles wide, rank upon rank of warriors from 20 nations. But here's what the ancient sources rarely emphasize. The Persians were exhausted before the battle even began. They had stood at arms all night, while the Macedonians emerged fresh from sleep. Alexander himself appeared remarkably calm, performing the morning sacrifices methodically. Then came the omen that electrified his army. An eagle soared overhead, flying directly toward Darius's position. The priests declared Zeus himself blessed their enterprise. What happened next would haunt Darius forever. Instead of attacking straight ahead as expected, Alexander began leading his army obliquely to the right. Picture this moment, 47-0 men moving in perfect coordination, not toward the enemy, but at an angle, like a spear thrust aimed not at the chest, but sliding toward the heart. The prodromoi, Alexander's light cavalry scouts, made first contact with Persian horsemen on the wings. Arrows whistled through the morning air. The first blood darkened the sand, but these were probing attacks. Each side testing the other's responses. The real battle hadn't begun. This is where Alexander's genius revealed itself. His rightward movement forced Darius to make a choice. If the Persians held their position, Alexander might outflank them. If they extended their line to match his movement, they would create gaps. Every step right pulled the Persian line like a rope under tension. From his elevated chariot throne, Darius watched this strange maneuver with growing concern. His generals urged immediate attack, while they still held overwhelming advantage. But wait, Darius had one final gambit. He had planned for this battle for weeks. He wouldn't be drawn into premature action. The distance between the armies shrank. 2-0 ids 500 within arrow range now. Scythian horse archers began their deadly work, their composite bows sending arrows arcing into Macedonian shields. The distinctive thunk, thunk, thunk of arrows hitting wood filled the air. Men began falling, but the Macedonians maintained their oblique approach, shields locked, pace steady. What followed was not a battle, but a chess match with living pieces. Each movement calculated, each response measured. Alexander continued drifting right. The Persian line stretched to match. Then everything went catastrophically wrong for the Persians. In extending their line, gaps began appearing in their formation. Small at first, barely noticeable in the dust and confusion, but Alexander's trained eye caught them immediately. Years of study under Aristotle had taught him to see patterns others missed. The next 30 seconds would decide everything. Bessus, commanding the Persian left wing, could no longer tolerate the Macedonian movement. He ordered his Bactrian and Scian cavalry forward 10-0 horsemen thundering across the cleared ground, their war cries echoing across the plain. The ground itself would remember this moment. The thunder of 40-0 hooves, Macedonian cavalry wheeling to meet the charge, created a rumbling that could be felt through soldiers' sandals. Dust rose in great clouds, turning the morning sun into a bronze disk. This is the moment empires die, when discipline meets chaos. The Macedonian companion cavalry, outnumbered 5-1, held their wedge formation. They didn't charge wildly, but waited for the perfect moment. Then, at some signal only they understood, they spurred forward as one. The collision was audible a mile away. Bronze spear points met flesh. Horses screamed. Men shouted in a dozen languages. But here's where courage met mathematics. Despite being outnumbered, the Macedonians' superior training began to tell. They fought as a unit, while the Persian cavalry, drawn from different nations, lacked cohesion. What Darius saw next broke his will forever. Well, almost. His cavalry, his magnificent cavalry that should have swept the Macedonians away like leaves, was being held. Worse, Alexander's rightward movement continued. The gap in the Persian center grew wider. Alexander personally led from the front, his distinctive double-plumed helmet making him visible to both armies. This wasn't just leadership. It was calculated psychological warfare. Every Persian knew that killing Alexander would end the invasion. His visible presence drew enemy attention and attacks, creating more chaos, more gaps. But the killing was just beginning. As the cavalry battle raged on the wings, Alexander watched the Persian center. He was waiting for something, some perfect moment that only he could see. His hypaspists stood ready, their shorter spears ideal for the close combat to come. History pivoted on these next 10 seconds. The gap in the Persian line was now 100 m wide. In the dust and confusion of the cavalry battle, most Persian commanders didn't notice, but Alexander did. He raised his spear, pointed at Darius's position, and shouted the word that would echo through history. Allah. Then Darius unleashed his terror weapons. 200 scythe chariots lurched forward, their drivers whipping the armored horses into a frenzy. The blades on their wheels caught the morning sun, creating a dazzling, terrifying spectacle. Each chariot represented death incarnate. 3 ft of sharpened bronze extending from each wheel, designed to cut men in half. The ground shook. The rumble built from a distant thunder to an immediate roar. Persian warriors cheered as their terror weapons charged. Surely nothing could stand against this iron avalanche. The mathematics of courage seemed meaningless against such mechanical death. But the Macedonians had trained for this exact moment. What happened next defied every rule of ancient warfare. Instead of breaking in panic, the phalanx opened lanes with precision that would make a drill instructor weep. Like a curtain parting, disciplined gaps appeared in the Macedonian line. Here's where the detail changes everything. The light infantry hidden behind the phalanx emerged with javelins. As chariots thundered through the lanes, these men attacked from the sides, hurling javelins at drivers and horses. It was controlled chaos, planned disorder. The screech of metal on metal filled the air as chariots collided with each other in confusion. Horses, wounded and panicked, turned back toward their own lines. Drivers fell, pierced by javelins, their vehicles becoming runaway missiles, crashing into Persian infantry. But then came the reversal nobody expected. Of 200 chariots, perhaps a dozen reached the Macedonian rear intact. There, Alexander's camp followers, the cooks, the baggage handlers, the grooms fell upon them with whatever weapons they could find. The terror weapons of the Persian Empire were destroyed by kitchen knives and tent stakes. In 15 minutes, Darius's carefully prepared surprise had not just failed. It had backfired catastrophically. Dead horses and overturned chariots now created obstacles that would hamper Persian movement. This psychological weapon had wounded Persian morale more than Macedonian bodies. Before the dust from the chariot assault settled, Bessus led his cavalry into the storm. 10-0 of Asia's finest horsemen, Bactrians, who could shoot backwards at full gallop, Scythians whose ancestors had never known defeat, Parthians who would one day humble Rome crashed into Alexander's right wing. individual moments of heroism and horror played out across a front half a mile wide. A Macedonian cavalryman named Cletus would save Alexander's life this day, cutting down a Persian who had raised his sword above the king's head. These personal combats, man against man, horse against horse, decided the fate of nations. The companion cavalry's wedge formation proved its worth. Like a spear point, it penetrated deep into the Persian mass before the edges made contact. This meant the Macedonians could bring maximum force to a single point, while the Persian numerical advantage meant nothing in the crush. Statistical shock: in 15 minutes, 3,000 men died in an area smaller than a modern city block. The ground became slippery with blood. Horses stumbled over bodies. The wounded crawled beneath the hooves of the living, their screams lost in the din of combat. But then physics met flesh in ways that still horrify. A Persian nobleman's head split like a melon under a Macedonian sword. A companion cavalryman fell, his chest caved in by a mace. These weren't glorious deaths. They were mechanical, industrial in their efficiency. The Macedonian line bent backwards, curved like a bow under pressure. Persian numbers began to tell. Gaps appeared between Macedonian squadrons. For a moment, just a moment, it seemed the overwhelming numbers would prevail. But Alexander had something Darius never expected. He had kept reserves, fresh squadrons waiting for this exact moment. As the Persian cavalry became entangled, exhausted from their charge, these fresh troops hit their flanks. The hunter became the hunted, but wait, while this cavalry battle raged, something far more significant was happening in the center. The gap Alexander had been watching, waiting for, cultivating like a gardener tending a deadly flower, had finally bloomed to its full potential. The Persian line now stretched like a rope pulled too tight. In extending to prevent Alexander's flanking movement, they had created exactly what he wanted, a gap in their center where their line was thinnest. The morning sun, now climbing higher, illuminated this fatal floor. From the Persian side, a guard captain named Tigranes first noticed the danger. He sent runners to Darius, warning that the Greek phalanx was massing opposite the gap, but in the noise and confusion of battle, communicating across 3 miles of fighting men proved impossible. Alexander's feint to the right had been masterful misdirection, like a magician drawing attention to one hand while the other prepares the trick. He had focused Persian attention on the wings while preparing his killing blow for the center. The mathematics tell the story. The gap was now 100 m wide, defended by perhaps 2,000 Persian infantry, where there should have been 10,000. These men, levied troops from Babylonia, not elite soldiers, faced the prospect of receiving Alexander's entire striking force. Then came the sight that ended an empire's hope. Alexander reformed his companions into a massive wedge formation. The hypaspists formed up on their left. Together, they created a human spear point aimed directly at Darius's position just 400 m away through the gap. Perspective shifted to Darius himself, elevated on his chariot, finally seeing the trap that had been laid. His large army had become a liability. Its very size made it impossible to shift troops quickly enough to close the gap. He ordered reinforcements, but they were engaged on the wings a mile away. This is where genius met desperation. Alexander had turned every Persian advantage into a weakness. The cleared ground meant no obstacles for his charge. The extended line meant no reserves to plug gaps. The vast army meant poor communication and slow response. But then came Darius's last hope. His personal guard, the apple-bearers, moved to block the gap. These were the best warriors in the Persian Empire. Men who had sworn to die before letting an enemy reach their king. The moment of recognition was electric. Both armies seemed to pause, understanding that the next minute would decide not just the battle, but the fate of the known world. Alexander raised his spear, his trumpeter sounded the charge, history held its breath, Zeus sought, Alexander screamed, invoking Zeus, the savior. 2-0 companions and Hypaspes formed into a wedge formation that chroniclers compared to Zeus's own thunderbolt. At its tip rode Alexander himself, his white plumed helmet making him unmistakable, his personal unit of 300 bodyguards forming the cutting edge of destiny. The 400 charge took exactly 30 seconds. We know this because ancient cavalry training manuals specify the distance covered at battle gallop. 30 seconds that would determine whether European or Asian culture would dominate the next millennium. 30 seconds during which empires balanced on bronze spear points. The ground disappeared beneath pounding hooves. The wedge formation maintained its cohesion with discipline that seems impossible. Men riding stirrupless, controlling horses with their knees while leveling 12 T-lances, maintaining exact spacing with their neighbors. This wasn't just a charge. It was precision engineering at full gallop. The impact when bronze met flesh transcended normal battle. The Macedonian wedge hit the Persian center like a hammer striking glass. The first rank of Persian infantry simply ceased to exist, their bodies trampled or hurled aside. The second rank, seeing death approaching at 30 mph, began stepping backwards. The third rank turned and ran, but the apple-bearers held. These elite guards, knowing their sacred duty, locked shields and leveled spears. For a moment, one heartbeat. It seemed they might stop the charge. Then Alexander himself, leading from the very tip of the wedge, drove his lance through their captain's throat. The man fell, and with him fell the last hope of Persian resistance. What followed was not combat, but slaughter. The companions burst through the Persian center like a flood through a broken dam. Infantry tried to flee, but found their own mass blocking escape. The hyposaspists, following in the cavalry's wake, methodically killed anyone who still stood. From Darius's perspective at top, his chariot throne, the sight was apocalyptic. The Macedonian wedge drove straight toward him, an arrow of death aimed at his heart. He could see Alexander personally, the young king's face twisted in battle fury, his spear red with blood, his voice carrying over the den as he urged his men forward. Hand-to-hand combat erupted around the royal chariot. Alexander's bodyguard, a giant named Hephaestion, cut down Darius's driver. Persian nobles threw themselves between their emperor and the Macedonians, dying where they stood. The royal parasol-bearer fell, his blood spattering across Darius's purple robes. This is where empires die. In moments of personal terror, Darius, the King of Kings, Lord of Asia, descendant of Cyrus the Great, faced a choice. Stand and likely die, making himself a martyr, but perhaps rallying his army, or flee and live, abandoning his men, but preserving the dynasty. He chose life. Seizing the reins himself, Darius turned his chariot and fled. It was the moment that broke an empire's spine. Seeing their god-king fleeing, the Persian center collapsed instantly. Men threw down weapons and ran. Officers abandoned their units. An army became a mob in seconds, but the battle wasn't over. On the Macedonian left, old General Parmenion faced catastrophe. Persian cavalry had broken through, threatening the Macedonian camp and baggage train. Messengers reached Alexander, abandoned the pursuit of Darius or risk losing half his army. Alexander made the hardest choice of his life. He turned from pursuing the fleeing Persian emperor to save Pomanan. This decision would haunt him. Darius escaped to fight another day, but it saved the Macedonian army from potential disaster. The final phase was pursuit and slaughter. As Persian morale shattered completely, the ordered retreat became a rout. Men trampled their comrades in desperation to escape. The Macedonian cavalry, now reinforced and victorious everywhere, pursued without mercy. The cleared battlefield that Darius had so carefully prepared became a killing ground where fleeing men had nowhere to hide. In that moment, an empire died. The cascade effect of Darius's flight spread through the Persian host like a plague. Unit by unit, the massive army disintegrated. First the center, then the wings. Finally, even the elite units realized their cause was lost. What had been 250,000 organized soldiers became 250,000 terrified individuals seeking only survival. On the left wing, Parmenions' desperate defense had reached its crisis point. Moses, the Persian commander, had broken through with heavy cavalry. Macedonian servants and camp followers fought with cooking implements and medical tools against armored warriors. The baggage train, containing all the army's supplies and plunder, seemed moments from capture. Then came deliverance. Alexander's companion cavalry, wheeling back from their pursuit, struck the Persian cavalry in the rear. Trapped between Parmenions' infantry and Alexander's cavalry, Moses's force was annihilated. The old general, bleeding from 3 wounds, raised his sword in salute to his king. What happened next still defies belief. The slaughter of the rout exceeded anything the ancient world had seen. Bodies carpeted the plain for miles, men who had thrown away shields and armor to run faster, only to be ridden down by vengeful cavalry. The Macedonians, remembering Persian atrocities in Greece, showed no mercy. The death toll tells its own horrific story. 300 Macedonians dead versus 40 Persians, but numbers cannot capture the human catastrophe. Sons stepped over dead fathers. Brothers died reaching for each other. Proud warriors who had marched from India or Bactria ended their lives face down in Mesopotamian dust, killed while running. The capture of the Persian camp revealed wealth beyond imagining. The royal tent alone contained more gold than most Macedonians had seen in their lifetime. Darius's war chest meant to pay his enormous army fell intact into Alexander's hands. Suddenly, the always cash-strapped Macedonian army was the richest force in the ancient world. Individual moments of aftermath seared into memory. Persian nobles, rather than face capture, fell on their swords in the ancient tradition. One Macedonian soldier found enough gold in a dead Persian's armor to buy a farm back home. The screams of the wounded created a chorus that lasted through the night. But here's what the ancient sources rarely mention: the fate of the defeated. Thousands of Persian soldiers abandoned by their officers surrendered. Alexander, in a stroke of genius, offered them service in his army. Many accepted, beginning the fusion of East and West that would characterize his empire. The immediate military consequences were staggering. The Persian field army, the force that had protected the empire for 2 centuries, had ceased to exist. The road to Babylon lay open. More importantly, Persian prestige was shattered. If 47,000 could destroy 250,000, perhaps the empire wasn't invincible after all. Darius's flight into the night became the stuff of legend. Abandoning his chariot when the roads became too rough, he fled on horseback with a handful of guards. Behind him, his empire crumbled. Satraps who had ruled in his name now considered their own interests. The Persian Empire, which had taken Cyrus the Great decades to build, fell apart in hours. Alexander stood on the field as the sun set, surveying the devastation. According to Plutarch, he wept not from sorrow, but from the realization that he had no more enemies worthy of his genius. The battle had lasted just 4 hours. The Persian Empire, which had endured 220 years, effectively ended with those 4 hours. But one detail changes everything about this victory. Among the captured documents in Darius's tent, Alexander found correspondence with Greek cities promising gold for rebellion against Macedonia. The victory at Gaugamela hadn't just defeated a present enemy, it had prevented future catastrophe. That night, as funeral pyres burned for the Macedonian dead, and vultures circled over Persian corpses, the world had fundamentally changed. The center of civilization would shift from Asia to Europe. Greek culture would spread to the Indus. The Hellenistic age had begun in blood and fire. The statistics are staggering, but worth repeating. The battle lasted 4 hours. The empire had lasted 220 years, both ended together, from sunrise to sunset on October 1st, 331 B.C.E. The ancient world had been completely transformed, but Gaugamela's true impact would echo for millennia. The immediate consequences unfolded with stunning rapidity. Babylon, the greatest city in the world, surrendered without a fight. Its priests welcomed Alexander as liberator, not conqueror. The psychological impact of Gaugamela meant that resistance seemed futile. If the full Persian army couldn't stop Alexander, what hope did individual cities have? Darius's eventual fate proved even more pathetic than his flight. Pursued into the eastern provinces, he was murdered by Bessus, his own satrap, who hoped to curry favor with Alexander. The last Achaemenid emperor died not in battle but betrayed, his body found in a cart by the roadside. Alexander, showing remarkable nobility, gave his fallen enemy a royal funeral. With this victory, Alexander became Lord of Asia, a title that meant more than geography. He had proven that Western discipline could defeat Eastern numbers, that tactical innovation could overcome traditional superiority. The balance of world power shifted decisively from Asia to Europe, a shift that would define the next 2 years. The long-term impact revolutionized warfare itself. Gaugamela became the textbook for combined arms tactics, the coordination of infantry, cavalry, and light troops that would dominate battlefields through history. Napoleon studied this battle. Patton quoted it. Modern militarismes still analyze Alexander's oblique approach, but the philosophical implications run deeper. Gaugamela proves that in war, as in life, the mind conquers numbers. Alexander won not through strength, but through psychological manipulation, exhausting enemies without fighting, creating gaps through misdirection, timing the decisive moment perfectly. He turned every enemy advantage into weakness. Consider the modern parallels. Every underdog victory, every David versus Goliath moment echoes Gaugamela. When technology startups defeat established giants, when small nations resist empires, when individuals stand against systems, they channel the same principle Alexander proved. That courage plus intelligence can overcome any odds. The Hellenistic age that followed transformed human civilization. Greek became the common language from Egypt to India. Science, philosophy, and art cross-pollinated between cultures that had been separated for millennia. The library of Alexandria, the mathematics of Euclid, the astronomy of Ptolemy grew from seeds planted at Gaugamela. Those 47,000 men didn't just win a battle. They created the cultural fusion that would produce everything from Buddhist Greek art to the New Testament being written in Greek. They proved that East and West could merge, that conquest could lead to synthesis rather than mere domination. Yet darkness shadowed this triumph. Alexander's victory disease would eventually destroy him. The man who conquered the world couldn't conquer himself, dying at 32 from fever, poison, or perhaps the accumulated toll of wounds and hubris. Gaugamela gave him the world, but also the arrogance that would kill him. What can we learn? That impossible odds are just mathematics waiting for the right equation. That psychological warfare matters more than physical numbers. That preparation and exhaustion of enemies can happen before battle begins. That decisive moments require instant action. That sometimes the greatest victory contains the seeds of ultimate defeat. October 1st, 331 B.C.E. remains the day the ancient world ended and the modern began. On the plains of Gaugamela, courage met calculation, West met East, and a young man's ambition reshaped civilization forever. The age of Persia ended in a single afternoon. The age of Alexander, and through him our age, began with a 30-con charge that still echoes through